Hey, this is Professor Lilly, and I want to give you a brief overview of Module 3 on privacy. And you might hear my dog chewing on a bone in the background, and my kids are both doing virtual school upstairs, so I think this is the best spot here on the couch to talk with you briefly. At this point, you all are, I think, understand the flow of the module, so like all the other modules, Module 3 will be 3 weeks. John and Robert are the module leaders, and right now they are starting to work on their presentation that they will submit next week for everybody to watch and then start the discussion. I am in the middle of grading for modules 1 and modules 2, so whenever I grade, the gradebook should send you an announcement. Um, Everyone's doing pretty well, keeping up with all the work, and the discussions have been great so far. So keep up the good work. So with privacy, I thought I'd start with this. It's the Minority Report, which is based on a novel by Philip Dick, who was a famous sci-fi writer, and also wrote the book that Blade Runner is based off of, and and this gets into two of the really big aspects of privacy. So let me play it real quick. Okay, so I don't think you can get the audio here. So let me explain what's happening. Tom Cruise is playing a future police officer who's actually on the run from the law, and everywhere he goes, his eyes are being scanned. And so, as you can imagine, it's going to be very difficult for him to get away from the police at this time. And at the end of the clip, this is someone on YouTube modified it, and right here he shows up, and instead of recognizing him as him, they say, "Hello, Mr. Yakamoto. Welcome back to the Gap." So what he ended up having to do was go and have someone replace his eyeballs so that he was no longer recognized in order to clear his name. So the reason why I started with that was because I think it's very interesting, or it's a great example of the two big issues or two kind of areas of privacy right now, and that's the big corporations and how they use emerging media to gather a lot of data on you. Much of it we are giving them permission for example, with Facebook to do that, and how they collect that data and what they're doing with it. And then on the other side, government and how it collects data on you and surveils us all, and using emerging media technologies, and then also what they do with that. So the first, just one second, I realize I lost my Moodle page, or our Moodle page. So your first reading in the module by Justices Warren and Brandeis kind of gets into a theory of privacy law, and where that comes from, and their kind of understanding of what we should expect for privacy in American society at that point in the 19th century. And so as they point out, that the word privacy or privacy rights are not explicitly mentioned in the First Amendment in the way that a right to speech or freedom of the press is mentioned. And a lot of speculation is that the reason why the writers of the Constitution didn't really include it in there is because it was so understood as a right and expectation in many different ways. For example, the fact that local jurisdictions would have laws against burglary, of course. So the understanding that you can expect people not to come into your home and take stuff from you. And then also in the Fourth Amendment, protecting you from unreasonable seizures without due course of the law is also obviously implicitly a privacy right. And in this article I found here that I was kind of just interested because I know I've mentioned in classes before the concept of a man's home is his castle, going back to around the time of the Magna Carta, and being kind of a saying that really evokes the idea that individuals who aren't necessarily kings or lords, but the common person has rights to privacy, especially in their home. And well, here's a little quote about the Magna Carta here. So the Magna Carta also doesn't necessarily evoke the term privacy, but what it does talk about is the right of all citizens to be able to inherit property, to have property, and also for the authorities to have to go through any kind of due process before that they would be able to take anything away or go into your house in unauthorized kind of way. And all of this is obviously evoked in the Fourth Amendment and other aspects of the Constitution as well. So it goes that far back. And so in particular, and one thing we don't really get into, so I wanted to mention is for Brandeis, his reaction and kind of formation of what he felt like were rights to privacy in the United States were connected to the fact that since he was a celebrity and lots of the media, the newspapers would often write scandalous things about him, about his family, and so this is connected to the constitutionality of libel law and also laws that protect someone from the publishing of private and embarrassing facts, and most states have that kind of law. So libel protecting you against something being published about you that's false, but also these laws for private right here, publishing private embarrassing facts, recognize that there could be private facts about you, something about your personal life, your private life, that you can expect that people don't need to publish and talk about, and as long as you keep those things private and don't thrust them out into the public sphere, you can expect a right to have protection against people publishing those things about you. So I mentioned that in particular because this module doesn't really get into that as much. I mean, we could, but we have to draw the line somewhere because we're already covering so many different areas. So we go from the concept of a person's home being their private space, and slowly as more and more technologies come around, this gets your privacy sphere. Then the concept of that gets expanded to maybe wherever you're going, having private type conversations. And the big court case for this was Katz versus United States. You see here it's 50 years old, and in this case, Katz goes to a phone booth and is having a private conversation in a phone booth. And the government is listening in using the surveillance technologies of the time on his end of the conversation. The question is the government at that time says, well, he's not in his home. He doesn't have an expectation of privacy because he's on the street in this payphone talking to someone. And the court is going to find that no, indeed, he does have an expectation to a right to a private type conversation wherever he goes, if there is that expectation of privacy. So if I'm in the middle of the street yelling something out, then obviously I don't have that expectation. Or if I go into a public place and do something like a demonstrative type expectation, that I don't have the demonstrative, like I'm doing something crazy and people taking photos of me. I don't have an expectation there of privacy. But if I'm in my home, or for students, I mentioned this, if you're in your dorm room, you have an expectation of privacy there for people not to be taking photos of you or surveilling you. And this is the really big case because it's still evoked today. as this article insinuates, about cyber surveillance and what type of expectations you have for privacy in your dealings with email, for example, or video chats and things like that, that use technology that goes outside of your home, but still you're considering them to be pretty much private communications. So this gets us into the government side of what we saw in Minority Report, where the surveillance technologies were being used to follow him around. And getting back to Moodle, so this gets down into the second section here with some readings. Now, I had one student last semester who mentioned, well, can we get more into the more recent stuff about Patriot Act? In the reauthorization, I mean, I don't want to get so much into the nitty gritty. I mean, we could have a whole law class on the Patriot Act and privacy and surveillance and the way the government works. It gets kind of messy. Like even today, I was kind of reading up, and it hasn't officially been reauthorized. There's been some kind of stopgap measures to make sure that certain aspects of it, of surveillance, have been kind of continued and passed on. But at this point, I think perhaps maybe with the pandemic kind of interrupting things, there still hasn't been, if we see here at the bottom, there still hasn't been an official reauthorization. There is another act called I think it's called the U.S. Freedom Act, that has incorporated certain aspects, but it also needs to be reauthorized soon. So I don't want to get into all these nitty gritty. It's more important to focus on the concepts of surveillance and what they're able to do with these technologies, and whether or not they should be doing it, and what are the pros and cons. So, for example, with the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, so there was a lot of flack because the bombers were being kind of under the radar of surveillance agencies of the FBI, and so there was a lot of flack for that because they were using the technologies, but hadn't made a decision in terms of these two individuals to do anything to them. But the technologies were used quite effectively in trying to track them down. So it only took 3 days to track them down, and they used the public security cameras that were all over the area to find them, or to realize who it was that placed the bombs, and then also to track them down. I do believe it was the Cambridge area, and also through cell phones, and to be able to figure out where they are and track them down and eventually confront them. So in that sense, the one side of the argument is that these technologies can really help to keep society safe from individuals that might that would do things like that, terrorist acts. And in fact, I was reading an article the other day that says one of the reasons why there haven't been a lot of domestic terrorism cases is because the use of surveillance of social media to close those people down before they act. For example, as in the case of the plans that were being made by right-wing extremists to capture or to kidnap the governor of Michigan. So there's been a lot of success in using surveillance technologies to stop those things from happening before they do. The other side is, of course, how is it curtailing our right to privacy? Obviously, today a lot of people use encrypting on their email and things like that if they don't want whoever to look into their email, which we can all assume that most of our communications are being surveilled, if not actually literally being looked at someone in the FBI. If you're not a person who's really that interesting, which is how most of us are probably seen by them. And that gets into the John Oliver video on Eric Snowden and the interview. That's the main reason is the interview. Like I said here, like last semester I had a student who was kind of offended. I mean, he's has kind of raw humor sometimes. So I don't want you to be offended, but there's other ways you can go online and you can find interviews with Snowden and articles about what his arguments were or are about how surveillance is really crushing privacy in America. Okay, and then we get to what private companies know about you. And I think for some of you, this might be, well, for all of you, I assume this would be very interesting. I mean, this is really getting into the application of new media technologies, and this is kind of where a lot of innovation is happening in terms of how we can use or how companies can use our data. And there's a lot of arguments for that they're helpful, right? I mean, I get a lot of great recommendations from Amazon and from Google based on their knowledge of my searches and on Amazon of my consumption habits that maybe helps me not waste a lot of time in terms of finding what I want. But at the same time, they have a lot of information about you. I just found an interesting article about how you can go and download all the data that Facebook has on you, and you can kind of really see the richness of what they're collecting about you and how they're using it to tailor suggestions for you. And they're also, selling that information, and there's a lot of kind of sharing that's happening between companies like Facebook and Google, even if they are competitors in some aspects. And then, lastly, we get to the differences in how the EU has tried to kind of legislate and conceptualize the right to privacy vis-a-vis media companies collecting data on you and their concept of the right to be forgotten. So hopefully John and Robert can also touch on this at the end of their presentation. So indeed, I mean, don't get too, then we get more into the future, similar to what we were seeing with Minority Report there. And obviously there's been lots of calls for Google and Amazon to really step up and acknowledge what they're taking in terms of people's privacy and how they're trying to protect it. Certainly in terms of Facebook and how it's been used and drawn into political controversies, and how they can tailor, give information about people's kind of political leanings and how in the past and maybe right now it might be being used to manipulate people. And that kind of wraps it up. So it's a very interesting module, I think. Feel free to kind of, if one or more reading are too confusing, to do a little bit of your own snooping. And if you find some useful information, then let us know about it in the discussion. So I'm looking forward to seeing the discussion next week and the presentation. And obviously this week is all about getting to the reading. So I hope you enjoy it.